really rethink time and space. You guys know Einstein, right? You know his wormhole theory. Yeah, so we're getting to a really interesting moment in time and space in the planet, where these devices allow us to transform time and space, literally. And we are doing these kind of experimental open source platforms that you could be in a garage, you could be in a classroom, you could be in a church, you could be outside, you could be wherever. But it's kind of really interesting. It's hyper connected through these moments, right? If we connect and share information, and it's really important to get that information out as, you know, like a fractal, a little pattern in design that you just keep scaling and patterning. We could record this right now, and I could send it to 15 classrooms in Chicago on the South Side. They don't have access to any of the information, and all of a sudden they're recreating the conversation in their own way. So that's one thing we're experimenting with. A little bit more on that later. So my focus has been on this concept of regenerative placemaking. I'm not the biggest fan of the concept of quote-unquote placemaking. It is in there because it is an important discussion around rediscovery of a place. There can be two different directions you can go. You can recover and uncover the history of a place, or you can colonize the place by calling it a discovery. So I do a lot of stuff around art, architecture, and urban design and planning, and also I'm a fish farmer, aquapon rather, not just a fish farmer, and I am a farmer. So, blight to life. This is an ecological transit. It very plays on word and rhetoric in ecological approach towards transforming blight to life. Everybody's familiar with the term blight, right? By quick show of hands. How do you know the term blight? Urban decay, right? So do you know that it is actually from paleontology and the study of plants? It's the death and decay of a crop so that it no longer sustains life. It's a tricky word. So if you say that it's a blighted building, it means one thing. It usually means it has lost its economic value or its productivity. If you say that a community is a blighted community, that's a whole other conversation. That's a very negative way of describing a community having no assets. So, background quickly: bachelor's of architecture, master's of science in architecture and urban design, and I did a doctoral program at Columbia University for planning. So I did a lot of stuff around concepts of architecture as art and science. And with respect to that, you can just do photos if you wanted to. You don't have to do full video. The art and science of building, and usually it's a formation of construct. It's supposed to reflect our consciousness, some level of consciousness. Same thing with industrial design. It's supposed to be an interrogation of materials and materiality to come up with this innovative, adaptive use of a product to think about things and how things work in society, like the products around here. Urban planning is much more around the economic functions and the social interplay. Supposed to be. There's an interesting dynamic. Urban planning tends to feel powerless because they don't have the rock stars that command the attention, because the built thing becomes the magnet for an image of capital and power. The urban planning is much more of the system. And art is, I try not to do this, but for the sake of presentations, you have to put a label and description on things. Art typically, to me, is something that is created with imagination and skill. It is beautiful in the eye of the beholder. It is subjective, but it expresses an important idea or feeling about something. So, just a couple of terminologies to get the values and the grounding first before we dive into the actual case. This is all set in motion, our paradigm, the way of being and way of doing certain things, the rules of thumb. A lot of things that we know are falling apart because they don't make sense anymore. You understand what I mean? Does anybody know what I mean? Rules of doing certain things, particularly for like the housing collapse, housing bubble. There's a particular way of doing it for economic valuation a certain kind of way that maximized capital, but then all of a sudden the bubble bursts and then all this domino effect starts to happen. We have to rethink, how do we redo it? World War II was easier because we could flatten other countries or populations and economies, and it just built housing, and all of a sudden our housing went back up, our economy went stable. Now we're not at that moment. So the city becomes a canvas in rethinking. My city was Chicago, still is. Chicago is interesting because it's very gorgeous. It's very picturesque. It's very postcard-like in a lot of ways. It is also an example of architectural marvels and wonders and beauty. I mean, per decade, when you look at the shift in the landscape from the built environment, it's interesting. You know, materials, statements of power, and architectural rock stars. But there's this weird craziness of abstract and representation. So this is actually a rendering, because our renderings are so great, of a development that's coming. The materiality is the most important aspect. If you look at what's the main material, right? It is an aesthetic that represents what?
Transparency.
Supposedly, right? But it represents power, money, and it's come to represent a certain population that will live there, in that area. So again, this is downtown. 40-story building, all made of glass, luxury, Michigan, $1 million mile. Just this formal typology of the expression. It's beautiful, and it has a certain kind of aesthetic quality towards it. Same thing, right? These are all renderings, but our rendering tools are now allow us to render in a way that we can go straight to production. This is interesting, right? So here's a historic building from the turn of the century, the post office, 40 acres of building. 40 acres of building that's straddling a highway. So you can't really demolish that. So it became wasted and blighted. And now there's all these $200 million proposals of just adding green roofs, adding green things and elements to it, or lots of glass. And somehow that treatment will bring that building back to life. It's odd, right? That's an odd way to rethink how to revitalize a building. And it's also in an area that does not need that. It's right downtown. It doesn't need a several $100 million development. So this question of space and place is where we're going to frame the concept of waste and the interplay of meaning and value played out in space, particularly as it comes across Tales of Two Cities. Now, most cities are experiencing have and have not dichotomy. Chicago particularly has a huge problem, and it's historic. Boston has similar problems, Baltimore, most major cities. Chicago in particular has it around race and class, particularly. So when you have housing, public housing, that is designed by architects, but it is flanked by urban renewal, which destroys a neighborhood in order to build these buildings, but you're anchored in a certain value base of that era, it plays out in space. So if you are not familiar with this, I suggest you check Martin Luther King Jr.'s The Other America speech, where he talked about it in 1968 around the quality issues of the other America, education, housing, etc. So what you get is you're left with an othering, these other spaces in other places for other people. Downtown framed a certain kind of way. Look at the materiality. You see the materiality break versus the, it plays out. This is also what used to be Cabrini Green. The other one was Robert Taylor Homes. Both of them, without money to support, investment of the public housing space, it became places of kind of terror. Right? They weren't policed. There was lots of gang activity, lots of crime, lots of all types of stuff. There was still home, but it was terrorized. So this concept of blight is interesting because it is from the death and decay of a crop, but it also has become something that is labeled as frustrating hope or plans. So it is an economic devaluation tool, and it is framed around externalities. The term externalities, everybody familiar with economics to a degree? Externalities is a way to think about the cost of development. So if something's if you build something and it affects the land immediately, or there's a lot of dust, residual dust, it's an externality. It's a cost of development. It's just a period of time that you have to do it in order to develop. It's tricky. So after a period of time, it's developed a certain level of aesthetic, and it becomes kind of violent. when you have to erase that thing, and then it perpetuates an image of the people that were there, lived there, and then there's a stigma and a perception that gets plagued and anchored to whoever's there. But look at the destruction process. It is an eating away. It's a very vicious process of erasure. So it's not just the physical erasure, because then what happens with the asbestos? What happens with anything that's like air? What happens to anybody that's in the area that's in the path of the air quality, right? Any of that stuff. The materials are just lost. And if they run when they run out of money, they tend to just board it up and then have it frozen. So you'll have these buildings from like 1940s and they're sitting, and they have usage, but then they're just seen as not having use. They're valueless, supposedly. That brick could be like 100 years old. Somehow, we just want to just tear it apart, get rid of it. So it's playing out at housing level right now. Foreclosure issue is wiping a lot of families out, left and right. And if you neglect it for too long, then it gets squatted and fires happen and stuff. This is the landscape we're pretty much working within right now. So it's the other America. And you get these remnants, palimpsests. It's like traces of the past. And it's interesting to see what economy was there, what people used to be there, all these stories. Chronic urban problems is like, it's funny, we have these ways of thinking about it in silos. Just study the physical deterioration, just study the poverty, just study the health issues, just study the environment. But these are all very interconnected. So we have this way of thinking about these landscapes of uneven development and structures of exclusion. So if you are in that neighborhood, what is your neighborhood? How do you think about a neighborhood? Do you think about a neighborhood? What is the education? What are the jobs? What's the sustainability? And how do you even begin to think about future if you don't have a life cycle in that neighborhood? Because most of them do not have life cycles. So I'm going to skip through this very quickly. The plan of Chicago was developed by the commercial club for thinking about commerce, not about the social activities and programming of the city. Made sense at the time. It was about economic engines. Ironically, where was all of the ports around the water? Where's all the waste being dumped? In the water, right? Where's all the waste? And that's part of the externalities, just cost of development. Just dump it. Just put it wherever. So the roadways got created. But now when you think about this as cities grow, and populations grow from 1900 to 2005, neighborhoods form. And class and perceptions form. Watch this. So 90% is, the red is 90% black, the blue is 90% white. This is from 1910 to about 2000. Great migration, and as people are starting to come in, and you're left with that landscape. It's bipolar. And there's lots of, now this is one thing, to actually go in those spaces feels a different way. It's very intense when you look at the south side of Chicago. There's like Milwaukee, north side, south side. It's just very, very, just has a different resonance. So when you start layering and thinking about this and overlay the maps, and you're looking at the vacant issues and the foreclosure issues and then the poverty issues, et cetera, it's all overlaid in the same thing. The health issues, the death issues, the access or lack of access to food, they're all in the same areas. Hyper-concentrated. And unfortunately, right now, we're suffering from some of the worst crime and violence we've seen in decades. It's a byproduct of that development, that pathway of thinking about who's valuable and who's not, what materials are valuable, what materials are not. So we are now on a pathway of apartheid South Africa. And this has been written about many times. So we are looking at a regenerative placemaking. Now we can get to the actual case study. Combining architecture, urban planning are just different ways to think about recreation through an ecological lens. And ecology is this interrelationship of organisms in their environment as a system, right? So, problem with urban agriculture in cities is what? Where do you farm in cities?
You can't farm.
Yeah, you could not legally farm in cities until recently, right? There was no space zoned for where to farm in cities. Why? Because who's thinking about our water systems? Who's thinking about our waste systems? Who's thinking about transportation and distribution? everyone thinks a farm is the way to produce, but what's actually produced on the majority of our farms? Corn and soy. So it's not part of most of our lettuce is coming from California. What's the problem with that?
Demands a lot of water.
Drought. What else?
A lot of money in transportation.
Transportation. There's a lot of issues with that, especially when you harvest. How do you store it? How do you store it in a certain way? There's this crazy thing about, like, when you open up certain packages, there's actually a level of CO2 that comes out the bag, because they had to pump it with carbon dioxide in order to preserve it. It's really bizarre. So in the city of Chicago, that's cattle stock from early 1930s, 20s, something like that. Right next to the industrial production. That water's great, right? So these are the spaces that we have to begin to think, like, what are the actual ways, and why are we doing food? Food is a gateway towards equity. It's a way to bring people together, to share, to heal, to mend, to bond. There's a lot of things about soil and food that's just basic. It's a basic human character. It's a basic human thing. So we challenge all of you in the room to rethink these things as a paradigm shift towards a new normal. All right, so our tagline is, there grows the neighborhood. And we'd say, instead of there goes the neighborhood, which is a perception of race and class and what have you, and history, we say there grows the neighborhood. So our mission is looking at regenerative placemaking and reviving the ecology of these blighted areas. So aquaponics, by show of hands, who knows it? Kind of. It's a recirculating water ecosystem. You can do it anywhere, as long as you have a source of light and electricity. So, feed the fish, they eat, they fertilize the water. If you don't change the water, what happens to the fish?
They die.
They die. Why?
Depletion of oxygen.
Oxygen